The past few years have seen growing calls to curb car use, the so-called war on cars, being led by an anti-car lobby that's supposedly concerned with climate change, urban livability and safety. Campaigns for things like low traffic neighborhoods, car-free city centers and expanded cycle lanes all fall into that desire to reduce our reliance on the automobile. But what if I told you that the anti-car movement had it all wrong? Well, first of all, you'd say, of course you're going to say that because you're the brown car guy and you're a petrol head and you love cars. True, but that push to ban, tax and restrict cars isn't just short-sighted, it's potentially harmful to the people who need them the most. I mean, look, regardless of me being the brown car guy, a petrol head, I get it. Emissions, congestion, safety, these are all valid and very important concerns. But the answer is not to ditch the car. It's how to fix how we use the car and fix where we use the car. And in this video, which is going to be a long video, but it's going to be an important one because I'm going to walk you through all of the major claims that the anti-car lobby makes against cars. And then we're going to calmly dismantle them with facts, data, and common sense. And then I'll also confirm why the car, far from being a relic of the past, is just as important to our lives today as it has been for, well over 100 years now. Let's get into that right after this.
A brown car guy.
So let's start with environmental concerns, emissions and pollution. Now, the anti-car argument goes that cars are a leading cause of climate change and pollution. Passenger vehicles burn fossil fuels, they emit carbon dioxide, and this all contributes to global warming as well as nitrogen oxides and particulates that harm the quality of the air that we breathe. Critics argue that to meet climate change targets and clean up city air, we must drastically reduce car use, if not abandon them altogether. It's true that cars do contribute to emissions. In 2022, transport accounted for about 28% of domestic UK carbon pollution, and cars were a significant proportion of that. However, the response to this idea isn't to just abandon cars, it's how we can improve them, make them cleaner, make them more efficient, etc., etc. And that's already been happening. Vehicle technology is already shifting rapidly towards sustainability. We of course have electric vehicles which produce zero tailpipe emissions, and their adoption of course is accelerating. In fact, we're up to about 20% this year, I believe, in new car sales being electric only, that is. We're still well short of the ZEV mandate, which requires an increasing percentage of new cars sold every year, up to 80% in 2030. That I think is 28% for this year, so we're going to fall well short of that, but we may get within maybe 7% of that, I think. But it does mean that nearly 1 in 5 new cars sold now today already are electric, and that already is a record high. And on top of the electric cars, don't forget there are hybrids as well, and that's quite important in terms of the emission and the cleanliness and also the efficiency of use as well. In fact, recently, Akio Toyoda, the chairman of Toyota no less, has gone on record to claim that hybrids are much better for the environment than electric. In fact, he goes as far as to say that the amount of emissions carbon footprint of one EV, you could have 3 hybrids for that. So he said that 27 million hybrids is equivalent to just 9 million EVs. So it's better to make the hybrids. That's what his argument is. Crucially, the grid also, where we get our power, that's also becoming greener and cleaner. And of course, that will also help cut carbon output once we end up with the power coming from cleaner and more sustainable supplies. Don't forget also that even conventional cars have become much more cleaner and efficient over time due to regulations and of course just improvement in technology. We have things like catalytic converters, fuel economy standards, more filtration systems. Carbon emissions per kilometer for new European cars have fallen significantly in the last 2 decades. Local air pollutants are also way down compared to the smoggy days of before. And I remember being a Londoner, how bad it used to get. I haven't experienced anything like that in over 15, 20 years, I reckon. For example, modern petrol cars, they produce a fraction of the nitrogen dioxide that the older models did. And this is thanks to things like the Euro 6 emission standards and what have you. So pollution levels have been dropping, and one report noted that air pollution plummeted between 2017 and early 2020. This was pre-pandemic, so don't say that, oh well, the pandemic has skewed that figures because obviously there were no cars on the road. No, this was before that, and that just reflects the improvement in technology. That was also not as much EV adoption was happening at that time. So this also, just like I said, it reflects just the improvement in the efficiency of the technology in cars itself. So the answer is not to just ban cars or to shift everything over as fast as possible to EV, but to continue this progress across all of the platforms and drivetrains that we have in the car industry, whether that be electric, hybrid, or other things like hydrogen, for example. Moreover, perspective is needed, right? Private cars are just one part of this emissions puzzle. There are other sectors, energy, industry, aviation, housing. They all need to decarbonize, not just cars. Singling out cars as climate villains, which is what the anti-car lobby does, I think is very short-sighted and very narrow-minded, and excludes the idea that we should be looking to a holistic pathway to clean innovation in all sectors and not just automotive. I think by just focusing on cars, we don't incentivize and encourage the other industries to be doing what the car industry has actually been doing already for quite a while. Okay, so having looked at emissions, now let's move from the atmosphere to the streets. And another common charge against cars, which is that they dominate urban space and cause congestion. So the argument goes, automobiles take up a disproportionate amount of space in cities, from wide roads slicing through neighborhoods to endless rows of parked cars consuming valuable land. Critics point out that cars often only carry one person and yet require quite a lot of room, and this leads to traffic jams and reduced space for housing and for parks and pedestrian areas. In city centres, cars are blamed for chronic congestion that wastes time and productivity. The anti-car lobby often cites city statistics like how much land is paid for cars and how many hours drivers sit in gridlock as evidence that personal cars are an inefficient way to move people in dense urban areas. Okay, look, so when it comes to cities, particularly inner cities, a lot of that is true, quite frankly. And I am a Londoner. I actually grew up in central London, right? So I actually have no objection to things like congestion charging and ULEZ that was when it was in central London. To be honest, to me it made sense because I knew how bad things were there. There is no denying that traditional car-centric planning has created challenges and problems. For instance, if you take London, 56%, so just over half of Londoners own a car. Yet on-street parking occupies about 14 kilometer squares of street space, and that's about 10 Hyde Parks, if you like. So, and then don't forget that the average car normally will sit parked for 95% of its time, particularly in a city where it isn't actually used that much. So, and this is another statistic that they often use to show inefficiency, right? And of course, congestion is also pretty bad. London drivers spend about 101 hours stuck in traffic on average. I think this is 2024 data, which makes it the highest in Europe. In fact, I think it got the accolade of being one of the slowest cities in the world. But do these facts justify the elimination of cars? Well, I think that they point to the fact that yes, we need to be more efficient about who has cars in cities and why and how they use them, but also looking at the better design and infrastructure of urban spaces to allow for better flow and for better parking of vehicles. And I think that London has not been doing a very good job of that, quite frankly. In fact, London seems to have done everything possible to make things worse by creating bottlenecks, by reducing the space for cars, by bus lanes and cycle lanes. Again, just tightening the traffic flow and slowing everything down seems like a deliberate move to actually make driving less desirable rather than make the traffic flow better and make things more conducive to more efficient motoring in cities, right? Traffic jams are mostly a symptom of infrastructure and planning lagging behind population growth. So instead of prohibiting cars, cities could invest in better road design. And looking at traffic lights, I was just out earlier today, and it seemed that on my route, which was an unnecessary 20 miles per hour route. This is the other problem. It's like, I'm in way out of London, right? And the road was wide and empty. There were no shops, no nothing. In fact, I think there was parkland, and there's a 20 miles per hour route, and there's no reason for it to be a 20 miles per hour route. And on top of that, every traffic light was just timed to go red as soon as just before you arrived at it. And it's just like somebody hasn't thought this through. You've slowed people down and then you've stopped them. So you're really trying to aggravate drivers, honestly. So like I said, adaptive traffic signals would help, real-time navigation apps, which I actually always use a navigation app even when I know where I'm going, just because it's updating constantly, and looking at how these congestion chargings and zones and emissions legislations are applied should be all part of the process of trying to improve flow and efficiency in city areas. The problem is not as bad outside of these dense urban areas. So the average UK driver, remember I said 101 hours for London, but outside, the average across the country is only 61 hours a year. So it's London that actually is skewing that higher rather than traffic in general. So the gridlock problem really is concentrated on a few big urban centres, which they need better public transport solutions. The reality is that central London is actually very well served by public transport. Not so much outer London, which is why I was so upset at the expansion of ULEZ, which doesn't make any sense. Invariably, trying to go from A to B in outer London involves going into London and then coming back out again using public transport. Conversely, in central London itself, it's very well interconnected. So there is a good argument for not really needing a car, and I certainly don't drive into central London myself anymore either, even though we used to live in central London and I used to own a car. But things have changed a lot since then. In fact, I'm talking about 80s and 90s, for example, things were quite different. For example, in 1995, the UK population was 58 million. 30 years later, so 3 decades later, since 1995 to 2025, we're looking at about 69 million. So we've got an increase of about 11 million people in the UK. Which actually, in 30 years, if you think about it, is not as bad as you might think. However, it has led to an exponential increase in cars. So, for example, in 1995, we had probably about 21 million cars estimated, but now we have between 35 to 40 million vehicles on the road. Just in terms of cars, I think it's about 34 million. So that increase is significant. In fact, that's a factor of 13 million increase compared to 11 million population. A 13 million car population has increased. If you just take London on its own, in 1995 we talked about 7 million Londoners. Now we're talking closer to 10 million at 9.8. So clearly, there is an issue in London, and that makes a lot of sense to look at those issues. But that doesn't apply to everywhere. Parking also is a problem. Cars need places to park. But again, I see a lot of this, and I see a lot of this here in Wembley, not far from me, which is where a lot of new luxury apartment blocks or just apartment blocks are being built, but very little thought and consideration is being given to parking. In fact, even going to Wembley now, there used to be the massive open-air car parks. They've just got rid of that completely. There are some multi-story car parks, but they're not as convenient as that huge car park was, which they've now replaced with just yet more buildings. But I don't know if they've built proper infrastructure to parking for the residents that are supposedly going to move into those buildings, or maybe the idea is just to discourage those residents from having cars altogether. Nonetheless, there are ideas that can be deployed in cities, such as flexible street use, time variations of what time you can park, or what time is used for loading, or what time is used for deliveries, etc., etc. Space can be optimized in such a way that it could make sense both for residents and for commercial requirements, and also visitors to the area, which for a city like London is very important, don't forget. The other thing, of course, is that we are on a path towards autonomous driverless cars. We have, in fact, legislation that makes them legal on the roads of the UK from 2026. And some of these taxi companies, such as, for example, Waymo or what have you, that have been operating driverless cars in other parts of the world, those are the ones with all the radars and sensors and everything on the roof. They are certainly looking at coming into the market. And as we get closer and closer to that level 5 autonomous driving, I think that's another thing where it will make things more efficient, because if you think about it in the sense that when humans park cars, they need space around the car to get in and out of the car, they need space to maneuver the car, so there are a lot of additional spaces required, say even in the car park, that isn't as efficient as it could be. However, if you have autonomous cars that simply can drive and stack themselves into really tight slots, and then maneuver themselves like Tetris blocks, if you like, once they need to come out or go back in again, then that would make even the density of parking much more efficient. And that we're already getting to that. And there's also not even the cars themselves, but there are other solutions. For example, I think I saw a video recently, Hyundai's head office, maybe in Korea, I can't remember where it was, but I just saw the video, and there were these two platforms, and these two platforms were robotic, and they were just going around the car park, and they would go under the car together. They would lift up the corners of the wheels, and then they would maneuver the car out and take it to its owner, and then bring it back, and then they were very, very adept at maneuvering and putting the cars where they needed to go. So again, even something like that would make things more efficient when it came to parking. There's also underground parking systems, parking storage, which is in multi-story, where you've got lifts, and the lifts will just take the car and slot it into spaces. So there are solutions. It's just that London doesn't necessarily have the desire or the investment required to deploy those solutions, and that, unfortunately, is a bit of a shame. Hope you're enjoying this video. Make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe if you're not already doing so. And support independent automotive journalism channels like mine. You can do that at patreon.com, coffee.com, or taking out a subscription right here on YouTube. Or you know what, better still, you can go and buy my books. I've got 3 books out now. They're all on Amazon. They're all available to buy. More details on this are in the description, but buying any of these books will certainly help. Thanks so much for watching. So let's move in the same vein in terms of urban spaces, from the talk of parking and putting these cars somewhere to pedestrianization and active travel. So the argument goes in this case that we should just pedestrianize city centers and residential areas to create safer, cleaner, more livable communities. Advocates point to example of European cities with large-scale car-free zones where cycling and walking thrive, and air quality has improved. The argument is that removing cars leads to vibrant street life and fewer accidents, as well as health benefits from more active travel. In this view, cars are incompatible with dense urban living. They belong in the outskirts, not in the city centers or quiet neighborhoods. These concepts include things like 15-minute cities, where everything is within a short walk of where you live. I mean, that would be great, and I've spoken about 15-minute cities before. I wouldn't want to live in a 15-minute city myself because I like cars, but I don't have any objection. I know a lot of people don't like cars, they don't want to drive. That's fine, and if they want to be living in a 15-minute city, that's also fine as well. I mean, there's a great idea of everything should be within 15 minutes of where you live. That's fantastic, but that cannot apply to countries like the UK, where there's existing infrastructure of residency and residential areas and housing. The way that a 15-minute city would work is by building it from scratch to serve that purpose. Let's be honest, right? You cannot. I mean, you look at where I'm living now, Northwest London, fairly central, right? But my nearest hospital is not a 15-minute walk away; it's a 20-minute drive away. Even in Northwest London, right? So you cannot just build hospitals willy-nilly, right? So, as we know, we were promised more hospitals. What happened to those? God knows. Anyway, we're just renovating, and the Northwick Park Hospital would be nice. Anyway, the point is that the concept of 15-minute cities is not a bad one. It's just that they have to be built from scratch. They have to be designed in such a way that they would work. And if they wanted to build, autonomous carts, electric carts, or tram system within that could also work, and it could make sense. And I have nothing against that at all. That's perfectly okay. But you can't take existing cities and then force them into 15-minute cities. I don't think that could work. Low traffic neighborhoods are another problem, because again, they are taking cars out of an environment where they've always been and where they're needed, where the residents that live there need their cars to get around, whether to school, to work, to hospital, to shopping, or whatever. The infrastructure doesn't exist for them to just completely abandon their car and live this idyllic 15-minute city life in a low traffic neighborhood. Pedestrianization itself isn't a bad thing either, and in fact they're talking now. I think the mayor has made a decision that Oxford Street is going to be pedestrianised. Again, personally, and being a Londoner and lived here a long time and spent a lot of time in the West End as well, because we didn't live far from there when I was younger, I don't see that as a problem, honestly. You can't actually, only buses and taxis drive on Oxford Street mostly anyway, so I don't really see that as a problem. The only issue is that, of course, sometimes when you want to get from one end of Oxford Street to the other, and you just, after a day of shopping, then you do want to jump on a bus to just take you across. So if you take away the buses, how will people get across? Again, if you replace them with hop-on, hop-off electric trams or rides, or go-karts, or electric go-karts, I mean stuff like that, then I don't mean go-karts, I mean golf carts, you know what I mean, golf buggies, that sort of thing, then that would make perfect sense. But if you take the whole length of Oxford Street and you pedestrianize it all, then you are going to lose business, because it's just going to be too much for people to get around. Maybe the bikes, the cycle rickshaw things that they have there, they will probably make a bit more money, because you'd probably jump into one of those, so that would make sense, I suppose. But again, not everybody, and that would be good for that, but the idea that everybody could just get a Lime bike or one of these bicycles or whatever, again, doesn't apply to a lot of people. Don't know how to ride a bike. A lot of people can't ride a bike because of physical difficulties. A lot of people are a little bit older. Me myself, I have a dodgy left knee, and and that came from riding a bike when I was a lot younger, and I've not ridden bikes since then. So it's not as easy to just say, oh well, people can just walk or ride a bicycle. It doesn't necessarily apply to everybody. In an ideal world, great, it would be fantastic, but it's not true. A blanket removal of cars from large areas can backfire if not carefully managed, because how will you pedestrianize it, but how do the pedestrians get there? How do they get away from there? How do businesses work? How do businesses flourish? How do businesses deliver? How do businesses get stock? You've got to think about all of these things. How do special needs or disabled or elderly or infirm, how do they get around in these areas? Are you expecting them to just walk everywhere? So you really do need that public transport infrastructure, both underground, overground, to really replace personal cars. But then you'll still need allowances for, like I said, special needs, disabled, hospital visits, stock supplies, business deliveries, etc., etc. You still need something. But in itself, I don't necessarily object to it. I just think that you need a balanced approach, which is happening in many UK towns, which have limited pedestrianisation with accessibility. Vehicles at certain times of day and what have you, and for certain types of vehicles like blue badge vehicles and stuff like that. So it kind of makes sense. But it's got to be a hand-in-hand thing. It's got to be one complements the other. It can't be one replaces the other. You can't just say, right, we're not having that anymore, we've got to have public transport, or we're not having public transport, we can only have cars. No. Like I said, I live in the outskirts of London, but when I go in London, I never drive. I use public transport because it's there and it's efficient, and why not? But if I have to go across town to somewhere also in the outskirts of London, I'd rather use a car because it's much easier. So all this talk of pedestrianisation, of course, means that what they're trying to do is to get us out of their cars. The argument, I guess, goes with the anti-car lobby, is that we are kind of addicts and cars are a drug that we're hooked on. Speaking as a petrol head, I think that's probably true for me, but not for everybody, I don't think. I think people are just about what is most convenient and easy for them, and so they talk about car dependency versus public transport, and they say that the society is too car dependent, and they say that the infrastructure of cities has been designed around cars, so therefore we are car dependent, which actually shoots their own argument in the foot, because yes, that's why we're car dependent. And as I said earlier, you have to create the environment and the infrastructure and the public transport infrastructure to complement, rather than just ban one thing and think that people are going to use the other alternative that doesn't necessarily exist in the form that they can actually use. They also argue, and this is where their argument kind of gets absurd, they argue that heavy car use leads to sedentary lifestyles, contributing to obesity and ill health. It isolates those who cannot drive, like the young or the poor, and hollows out communities as people drive long distances rather than live locally. The solution, say anti-car campaigners, is to massively expand public transport, walking, cycling, so the cars become largely unnecessary. In an ideal future, trains, trams, buses, bikes would handle the bulk of journeys with cars used sparingly. I don't really object to that last sentence, but the rest of it is nonsense. Yes, public transport and active travel options are important. You know, as I've already said, we need those, and we need those to complement, especially in tight urban spaces. I don't think so much in outside of cities, because literally you don't have the investment, the infrastructure, the space to make these systems. The cost is extensive, the time involved in making these is very, very high, and they're not necessarily function, because sometimes, you know, it's like when you build a train that goes to a station that only serves 2 people to commute out of there in the morning and come back in the evening. I mean, that's a whole lot of money you've spent on building a station or extending a train line in order to serve 2 people in a village. Do you see what I mean? It doesn't make sense, right? And even putting on a bus service wouldn't necessarily make sense, right? The UK is not a compact city-state. It does have vast rural areas and spread out towns, and millions of daily trips that simply, you know, can't be done by public transport. 2/3 of people in the UK do commute by car, and this includes not just in the city, but people obviously in towns, small towns, villages, suburbs, where the nearest their job might be, or their hospital or shopping. All these things might be 10 or 20 miles away from where they live. In Wales, 81% of people commute by car. In Scotland, it's 69%. Outside of big cities, public transport isn't necessarily a viable alternative. Buses may be infrequent or non-existent. Trains, like I said earlier, are only connected to major stations, they don't go to where you are. And if you happen to work nights or shifts, or say in the NHS, or you're a carer that needs to go to people and stuff like that, then, you know, public transport, buses and things may not run at the times that you need to use them, and it's just simply not an option. Now, you might end up still having to walk miles to get to somewhere, which, you know, if you have to visit, you know, 15 patients in a day or something, that's just not happening, is it? Whereas in a car, that gives you that freedom and that practicality to be able to do that job. And again, the other thing is about this is that it's important that, you know, you need vehicles to be able to do what you need to do, right? And that often means having a personal car. We should be asking how to provide choices without forcing people into what we want them to do, right? People will do whatever is convenient and good for them. And in many cases, not everybody wants to own a car. Not everybody wants to drive a car. And for some people, you know, they'll go, okay, yeah, I could use public transport, but it's just not viable. So therefore, they need to have the car, right? A mother doing a weekly supermarket run, picking up the kids from school, a tradesman visiting multiple jobs with lots of tools and stuff that they need to take around with them. You know, all of this, for this purpose, they may need and require having a car. It's just quicker, easier, more efficient, and more practical. And the other thing to think is that the average commute and by car in the UK is about 26 minutes, whereas if you take public transport, it's about 64 minutes. It's over an hour. So the time factor is another important part of this, you know. As I said, you know, how many visits you're going to do, how many jobs can you do in a day if you have to go on public transport and you just can't get the work done. For a lot of people that may be gigging or freelancing or, you know, doing that sort of stuff, that will cost them money. That just means they won't be able to take certain jobs on. And not only that, but just in terms of, if you think about mental health and all the rest of it, not being able to spend time with your families. If it's taking you twice as long to get home from work than it would do if you were taking a car, that's half an hour or to an hour, whatever. You're losing that time at home, or that time to do other things, you know, creativity or hobbies or whatever it is that you're doing. This is all valuable time, especially these days. You know, it is very valuable to eke out whatever free time you can. And using a car sometimes will give you significant proportions of free time. The other thing that the anti-car lobby often says, which I always find a little bit crazy, is that, you know, it's not equitable. It's not fair. The poor can't afford cars. Actually, that's not true, because even if you're poor but you need a car, you can get cars for a few £100, insurance for a few £100. You need it for a job, you can use it. But if you start to make it prohibitively expensive, which is already happening, and you start to ban them, then that will make it even more difficult for those people to own those cars, to do the jobs or to do the stuff that they need to do. So actually, you know, owning a car may not be cheap, but a lack of a car can mean not only job exclusion, but social exclusion in car-dependent areas. If we completely take away the car without providing alternatives, we hurt rural and low-income communities the most potentially. Public transport just may not reach them the way that it does in dense city centres. So it just doesn't make sense. Whether it's going for work, whether it's going for leisure, whether it's going for a doctor's appointment, suddenly we've created a whole problem for these people that can no longer use a car. of course, going back to the idea of autonomous cars or car sharing clubs and stuff like that, that's another thing where we could see that transitioning happening, and that could happen, but that still involves the car. So again, we can't demonize the car, because these things are driverless cars, autonomous cars, car sharing clubs, etc. They still need a car. Car sharing club, if you don't know, is where you don't own the car, but you can literally, like Lime Bikes today, you can just share, you can take the car when you need it if you're part of a subscription service or something like that. I don't think we have many of those here yet, but they have been operating in other parts of Europe already successfully for quite some years now. People need cars, and that's evident from the fact that 78% of households in England have at least one car. Outside of London, it's 80% and above. So that just proves people do need their cars. Car dependency exists for valid reasons in many cases. Okay, we can improve buses, we can improve trains, we can get better cycling facilities for people, but let's not punish those who genuinely need or prefer a car by making their lives harder or more expensive. Freedom of movement includes the freedom to choose the mode of transport that works best for you. And when you look at Britain's context of the mix of urban and rural, and also don't forget to factor in the weather, which can be very nasty, and it makes it incredibly hard to get around. If you're trying to cycle and it's just constantly raining, then that's not really viable, is it, honestly? So therefore, the car will remain a key part of this mix, that's transport mix, for the foreseeable future. We cannot just abandon it and ban it. Running a business these days, especially if you're a one-man army, is exhausting. Believe me, I can tell you all about it. From getting new clients to chasing payments to creating the content, it can be chaos. That's why I want to tell you about my friends at Pedestrianisation. Now, they help solopreneurs and small business owners, especially folks in the car scene, automate, scale, and actually grow their business. Websites, content strategy, Instagram, WhatsApp, it's all sorted. If you're ready to go from being overwhelmed to in control, book a 15-minute consult at the link in the description and tell them Brown Car Guy sent you. Road safety and technology improvements. So the argument goes, cars are deadly machines. Every year, thousands of people are killed or seriously injured in road accidents. Anti-car campaigners argue that reducing the number of cars and lowering speeds will save lives, especially for vulnerable pedestrians and cyclists. They often highlight the tragic case of collisions and note that a world with fewer cars or none at all would vastly improve safety on our streets. Well, okay, I mean, yes, no cars at all on the roads would mean no deaths by traffic accidents. That much is obvious, but if we have no cars, then nobody's going anywhere. What kind of life is that? And also, safety is paramount, right? And any death on the road is one too many. Let's just say that and get that out of the way and say that yes, we would be wonderful if we didn't have any deaths at all. But let's look at the reality, right? It's an unfair argument in the face of the huge strides that the car industry has made in terms of road safety. Car industry legislation, safety legislation has already made in terms of road safety, and that's without actually eliminating cars. In fact, we have more cars now. So for example, UK road fatalities have fallen around 3/4 since the early 1970s. So Britain had about 8,000 deaths a year in the 1970s on the roads. Today, these days, it's about 2,000 a year. In fact, in 2023, I think it was 1,650 or so. This is still tragic, and we should do everything possible to lower that. But that figure is in fact the lowest fatality rate per capita in the world. So we're not doing too badly if you think about it. That's not to negate anybody losing their loved one. Of course, that is a horrendous thing to happen. But if you have to look at it in just terms of cold analytical figures, the reality is that there have been vast improvements. And this is an environment where the number of cars on the road, as I illustrated earlier, have actually gone up. And the way that this has happened is through innovation and regulation, not by banning cars. And also, don't forget the other thing that I often bring up, which I can't really understand, is that there were huge campaigns, I remember growing up in the 70s and 80s, from seatbelt campaigns, to awareness campaigns and what have you. But also, there were things like the Green Cross Code. It was drummed into us at school. The roads are for cars, the pavements are for pedestrians. We're very fortunate in countries like the UK where we do have these things, because there are many countries that don't have a clear demarcation between where the cars are meant to be and where the pedestrians are meant to be. Sometimes it's all the same. But over here we have that clear demarcation in most cases, unless you're out on a country road. And the reality is that people were taught that you should not be where the cars are. Why are you walking around where the cars are? Of course, nowadays a lot of people are walking around with the mobile phones, and suddenly the onus is entirely on the car and the driver, which I think is a little bit unfair, because I think that sometimes, pedestrians need to be told, can you be careful, right? When there are cars and stuff around, you need to be careful. But like I said, there was a combination of seatbelt laws, drink driving crackdown, speed limit, improved speed limits, better road engineering, speed bumps, things like that. But most importantly, improvements in vehicle crash safety design, both for internal occupants for a car, but also even for pedestrians, because you have things like increased gap between the engine and the bonnet, pop-up bonnets, better crumple zones at the front, softer zones at the front of a car. People they don't build cars like they used to, and I say thank God they don't, because the cars are much safer now. People have a minor fender bender with a car, and it feels like the car is imploded, whereas in the old days you have a minor fender bender, and literally that's all it is, a fender bender. You could probably knock it back out with a hammer or pull the bumper back out. Nowadays you can't do that, and people are like, oh, these cars are crap, look at it, it's just self-destructed. But actually it's meant to do that, it's designed to do that, because that fact that the car has shattered is basically how it absorbs the energy, so that energy is not passed on to the occupants within the car, causing them internal injury or any kind of injury, even down to whiplash. And externally, if a pedestrian happens to hit it, again, the car will rather take the damage than inflicting the damage on the pedestrian. So it is definitely, the cars are a lot better. And then of course that's not even allowing for the fact that technology, anti-lock brakes, traction control, automatic braking, passenger detection, cross traffic alert, open door detection, blind spot detection. I mean, it's just incredible how many things cars and car technology now has in them, which means that the risk per mile has plummeted over the years. Portugal reduced road deaths by 84% in 30 years because of this. And also because of the laws, and like I said, the advanced driver assistance systems, ADAS, are becoming increasingly common, and they are accounting for a lot more reduction in any kind of accident, never mind road fatalities, but just a reduction in accidents. Just accidents that used to happen all the time, like getting rear-ended and stuff like that, are going down because cars are braking before you ever even realize that you needed to brake. The car is already doing it for you. So there's a massive improvement, and it's not fair to try and hammer the car industry over the head with a safety argument, because the car industry for a long time has been doing everything possible to make cars as safer and better as possible, both in terms of avoiding collisions, but also when collisions happens, mitigating the worst case scenarios. And then of course, don't forget, we're going towards autonomous driverless cars, where again, full autonomy of cars will again theoretically also improve road safety, because AI will be prone to making less mistakes than humans do. Humans also get tired, they may get distracted, etc., etc. So I mean, at the end of the day, banning cars outright might reduce collisions, but it's just not practical or necessary to do that in order to reduce accidents and road deaths. Cars are becoming safer all the time. And we just need to look at how we can continue to do that without saying dumb stuff like, let's just not have any cars. So now that we've looked at the main criticisms against the car, and I've given you the valid arguments against those, let's just reiterate the importance of the car itself. The cars are not just metal boxes on wheels, they represent a profound enabler to modern life, societal progress and economic development. The mass adoption of the vehicle in the 20th century coincided with enormous economic growth and social change. Cars allowed cities to expand and new towns to flourish. Industries around motorways often, industries grew around car manufacturing because you could build factories and plants and places, and people could commute back and forth. This fueled jobs and innovation. The automotive sector is a pillar of the UK economy, don't forget. It contributes about 2% of GDP. In fact, I can tell you that automotive-related manufacturing in the UK contributes 93 billion turnover pounds, 22 billion pounds value added to the UK economy, typically invests about 4 billion pounds each year in research and development. More than 198,000, nearly 200,000 people are directly employed in the car manufacturing industry, and in the peripheral. If you also include the peripheral industries and supply chains and all the rest of it, we're looking at over 800,000 people working across the wider automotive industry. So we're talking nearly 1 million people employed in this industry. Then you factor in globally, cars support vast supply chains. We're talking steel, plastics, electronics, software, computing. Cars mean commerce, right? The mobility that they provide underpins many industries: construction workers, construction vehicles, deliveries, farmers getting food to you, covering their land, tractors. Everything requires a vehicle these days. You cannot just ban vehicles. The entire world would just grind to a halt, literally. You just can't do that. Access to work, education services for many a car is key to accessing essential opportunities. 66% of commuters in Britain rely on cars to get to work. Cars can also enable access to education, students driving to college, parents driving kids to school, and of course healthcare and getting to hospitals and stuff like that, as we've already discussed. Take, for example, when COVID happened, right? And you couldn't use public transport. There was no public transport. How did people get around? The car. And they felt safer in their car, right? Because they didn't think they would catch any germs because they were in their own controlled environment. And this is very, very important to a lot of people. Freedom of movement and leisure, perhaps the most cherished aspect of the car, is the freedom that they offer, the ability to go where you want, when you want. There's no need to check a timetable. There's no need to limit yourself to which routes and then figure out how you're going to walk to somewhere. This freedom enriches our personal lives. The UK, for example, loves a Sunday drive, a road trip to the seaside of the country. In fact, Britons took an estimated 19.2 million leisure trips by car during a single bank holiday weekend, whether that's to the beach or a festival or a theme park or just to visit friends and family. Don't forget the societal aspect of it: visiting friends and family, visiting the elderly, visiting your loved ones. A car enables that. All of the Christmas dinners and what have you, right? So look at the weather at that time of year. The car enables you to do that. Sometimes your relatives may be in distant places, villages or whatever. How will you get to them? By car. That's how you will do it. The car also has opened up the country for exploration, right? Suddenly you go to places around the country where you didn't think you would go. Whether it's going up to Snowdonia or exploring the amazing places in Scotland by the incredible roads they got up there. All of these opportunities suddenly open themselves up to you, and then the ability to do stuff. You could go to IKEA and buy yourself a cabinet and come back and build it. Otherwise, you could do all of that in the same day because you could fit it in your car, rather than waiting for deliveries or what have you. So it's all about the convenience of having a car. Your personal space that moves with you. You can listen to your own music, keep your items, your things in there, travel in privacy, and not have to share it with other people that are coughing and spluttering and speaking into their phone or listening to their own music on their own stereo loudly, and not risk getting stabbed on the train and stuff like that. Has happened, So, and then of course we're talking about emergencies. If suddenly something happens, you need to get a loved one to a hospital or a friend or a neighbor or something like that, the car is there. There's so many aspects that are there where the car is a force for good. It's also a force for connectivity, connecting people to opportunities, to places, to each other. Societies with higher car ownership have greater dispersal of wealth in those societies. So, that's no coincidence, Where is it all going? Innovation for the future. The most obvious changes is the rise of the electric car and the hybrids. We've already noted the surge in EV adoption. We've already spoken about that. And they are continuing to climb. And I think that, we will get more and more improvement in tailpipe emissions. The reason I say tailpipe emissions is don't forget that you still get emissions from tires and from brakes. Although with EVs, you do get less emissions from brakes because they don't use the brakes so much, if hardly in some cases, but you get slightly more emissions from the tires. That stuff still is there. Even that is being legislated for conventional cars as well as EVs. So there is already efforts to get that down as well. And you can get it down, so ceramic brakes, for example. And again, more efficiency of driving, the connectivity, the better GPS, the ability to avoid traffic jams, to make that route and that journey more efficient, use less fuel, and create less particulate emission. All of these things are happening. Autonomous driving, as we've discussed, driverless cars, these are going to help because they're just going to be more efficient in how they're used. You don't necessarily own the car will only come to you when you need it, but at least it will be there, but it will still be a car. So it's still a car. That's important. So as we wrap up, The picture should be clear. The automobile is not an outdated relic on the verge of extinction, but an integral and evolving part of modern life. Cars do have their downside. No one denies that. I mean, I've already admitted to much of that. But the reality is that when you look at the positives versus the negatives, I think the positives far outweigh them. And those challenges, those problems that we do have, are being met with practical solutions, innovation, and technological answers. So they are getting better. So just to demonize the car, to ban the car, or to outright be dismissive of all the good that the car has done for us, I think is very, very short-sighted. So let's instead look at the car as something that is continuing its evolution. It started as a horseless carriage. Look at how it is today. I mean, if you go to the London to Brighton run and look at these, they're literally just a wooden platform with a tiller and a tiny one-cylinder engine. If that, from that to what you've got now, sophisticated cars with emergency systems, safety systems, filtration systems, it's just absolutely incredible. So the car isn't going away, it's just getting better. Instead of fighting a futile war against the cars, we should focus on a war against inefficiencies, a battle that we're actually already winning. The car, in one form or another, will continue to carry us forward, literally and figuratively, into a future where it remains an essential part of modern life. It'll just be cleaner, smarter, better in every way. That's a future that we can all look forward to, not a future without cars. Please make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe on your way out. I look forward to reading your comments, and I'll catch you all in the next video. Shout out time, guys. Thank you so much. Hey, if you enjoy my content, why not get involved? Buy me a coffee. You can do that at either of these links. Or if you're watching on YouTube, buy me a thanks or take out a membership. It all helps. It really does.